cargo of the damned. Naman-Sul completed the final line of the Psalm of Preservation, then ticked off the psalm chant marked below the flask. Without pause, he moved to the next freezer unit, beginning the last litany. The servitor choir chanted in time with his invocations, a rasping dirge of binary and corrupted High Gothic, remonstrating the dark gods with grim devotion. Kadon rubbed the back of his neck as he observed the Dark Mechanicus Magos and his team at work. This was the final step before the true work could begin. The past few weeks had been exhausting, stressful, back-breaking, and filled with endless complication. Ironically, moving the hollow crown had been the easy part. Valkaron had borne the brunt of the ritual labor, with Baelgor needing to do little more than metaphorically push. In a moment, an agonized blink of the warp's eye, the vast station had been torn from real space within the Arcana Inclusium and hurled, sailed, catapulted, translated, however one chose to phrase it, into orbit above the frozen world of Carvansari, on the outer edge of Incaloris space. That, however, was only the beginning. Sailing the Secular Reliquary to Incaloris with its mutated cargo and its resident, undead, ever-inquisitive Inquisitor had been a relatively simple task. Navigating past Navis Astra Wigathan patrols and the farcical defense fleet of Incaloris had been easy enough. The true objective had been the Librarius Ferrugineus, an Iron Hands transport ship ferrying Geneseed to NihtWyrtha. Geneseed intended to give birth to the so-called Void Revenants. Everything had gone to plan. The Drukhari, led by Void Reaver, had made their scripted raid and been chased off by escort ships, just as Kadon had arranged. The Ferrugineus fled into a nearby asteroid field, where Kadon, Baelgor, and Valkaron boarded one of its cargo hulls and cut it free. The Perfuga retrieved the section. Naman-Sul then swapped the Geneseed for chemically treated mock-ups. They scarred the interior with plasma, ruptured a thruster conduit, and vented the hold. When the Imperials eventually recovered the floating wreckage, they would see a burnt-out chamber, the cargo ostensibly destroyed in a plasma fire. No one would think to check the remains, certainly not thoroughly. The loss would be logged, written off, and incinerated. The Imperium would never realize a full case of Geneseed had been stolen from under their nose, and that made Kadon very happy. The next phase had been securing the armor blanks from the Secutor Reliquary, transporting them to Grimness, where the Dark Mechanicum could utilize recovered STC patterns to begin replication. Archmagos Sensarax Centauri had provided them with a standard template constructor, one of Grimness's most precious technologies, now safely sealed in the Perfuga's hold. That was where things had nearly collapsed. The sudden outbreak of the Trinova malady had nearly brought the entire operation to ruin, but in the end, it had proven useful. The chaos of the outbreak had masked the theft perfectly. Centauri had quietly disposed of the remaining staff who might have noticed the missing constructor. What Kadon found particularly amusing was that the entire incident had been cleansed, sanitized by flame, by the first of the Void Revenants themselves. There was a delicious irony to that. All in all, the Dark Gods had shown them clemency and a sense of humor. Naman-Sul, as if reading Kadon's thoughts, placed down the last scrap of parchment and turned toward him, his single optic lens whirring softly. Imperial records are riddled with gaps due to the interregnum. The fact that the Imperium can lose a cache of Astartes Geneseed like this is to them no more tragic than misplacing a piece of parchment behind a desk. Stupid, futile, and in the end, a sad reflection on their dying cult. Sedon sniffed, resting a gauntleted hand on the edge of the relic case containing the frozen gene samples. Crumbling, inefficient, broken even. But never underestimate the power of faith. The Imperium is unwieldy and creaking, but do not underestimate faith. The Dark Mechanicum Magos turned fully to face him, raising a hand to silence the choir. "I have seen many faiths," Noman said flatly, "and all of them can be bent to one's will. As forces go, it is a fickle one." Kadon nodded thoughtfully. "I know of faith. I've seen it make an angel fall to his knees in despair at a demigod's death, and I've seen it make a guardsman stand against a horde." Naman-Sul cocked his head, the candlelight gleaming across the curved metal of his cranium. "I assume you have witnessed both, Kadon Ferrisborn." He paused. "As have I." He glanced down at the cryo-cylinders before them. "Perhaps one day, this conflict will end." Sedon smiled. And where would be the fun in that? He pushed off the bulkhead and made his way through the decks. As he passed a conduit nestled between two ancient, non-functional plasma inducers, he noticed a cultist sitting in the dark. The man had come aboard at the Spine spaceport, another stray from the chaos on Grimness. Caden tried to remember his name but gave up, offering a curt nod instead. The man looked up and snapped a sharp salute, hand to chest, head bowed. Caden gave no response, continuing on toward the bridge. Markham watched the Chaos Astartes go, blinking slowly. Then, humming softly, he picked up the dirty cloth and began polishing the centuries-old auto pistol he'd been given. He polished the already gleaming steel with obsessive care, absently scratching the small wound on his leg beneath the makeshift cloth bandage. He was happy to have escaped the Forge world, happy to have escaped the drudgery of life on a Mechanicus planet. The ship's crew had taken him in, no questions asked, and he was determined to make it count. He would make this pistol gleam as it had on the day it was forged. It would be something to be proud of, a sign that he was fulfilling his new duty aboard ship. He stood and wandered the passageways, polishing as he walked. A trace of song lingered on his lips, softly hummed. But the sea took her name, and the sea took her kin. Several decks below, Astalon stood by a viewport, watching Grimness shrink in the distance. The massive Spine starport glistened in the clean light of the sun. He had never realized the sun was white. Planet-side, it had always been greenish and sickly, shrouded in the mists of industry. Up here, it seemed pure, untouched. He opened his travel bag. His blade clattered onto the bunk, catching the sunlight. "You really the stalker of Trinova?" He turned. Dagvar stood at the hatch, the same cultist who'd first greeted him aboard. One hand was tucked in his shirt, the other resting on the hilt of his pistol. It wasn't threatening. The pistol catch was fastened. It was just a comfortable pose. Astalon noticed things like that. Growing up a gutter urchin in Trinova taught you to survive. "In a former life, yes." "Ronald tell you?" he asked, already guessing the answer. "Yep," Dagvar said with a grin. "Said you got hunted down by a maiden." Astalon turned back to his kit. "She wasn't a maiden. She was a Skitarii hunter drone." Dagvar let out a low whistle. "Lucky you're alive, then. Guess the gods smiled on you." Astalon pulled out his old Mechanicus Adept's tunic, looked at his augmetic hand, and flexed the fingers. "We've yet to find out," he said quietly. Dagvar stepped inside, joining him at the viewport. "Hell of a place, Grimness," he said. "Then again, you could have lived on Incaloris. You get burnt, scarred, or blinded just walking outside the hive." He raised his scarred arm as proof, then winked with a glowing metallic eye. Astalon gave a small nod. "The Imperium is filled with strange worlds. I've yet to see most of them." "Then you'll love Carvansari," Dagvar said. "Frozen block of ice. Sorny comes from there." He nodded upward toward the bulkhead above them, toward the decks where Sorny Naevna sat at the helm. "The one with the tattoos?" Astalon asked. "Yeah, Uralkin. Bunch of techno-barbarians. We've got a station in orbit now. Well, we just moved it there. Not sure how. Some kind of magic from Baelgor, I guess." He shrugged, clearly out of his depth. "That Markham fellow seems nice enough. Said he's good with numbers." Astalon considered that. Ronald Markham hadn't been the cult's brightest, but he'd been an effective scribe, efficient, reliable. The kind of man who could keep the paperwork clean while the real work happened in the shadows. That kind of skill could be more useful than a dozen warriors. Dagvar, still chatting to fill the silence, added, "Odd little song he sings, must be one of your Trinovian epics." A shadow passed across the viewport. Dagvar looked out. "Would you look at that?" Astalon froze. Outside, a heavily armored warship drifted past. "Song?" Astalon asked softly. "Yeah," Dagvar said, still watching the ship. "Something about a lady in the sea." He trailed off. No reply came. He turned. Astalon was gone. The bunk was still there, the tunic still lay neatly folded, the knife was missing. Sorny gently touched the control column. Beside her, the servitor bank adjusted 100 different systems as the Perfuga made a slight course correction. She clicked the Vox link. Moyle patched her through with a silent nod, then sat back into his seat. "Grimness Traffic Control, this is the freighter Perfuga requesting translation position," Sorny said, her tone clipped and professional, no trace of her native accent. A few seconds passed. "This is Grimness Traffic Directory. Hold for 492 seconds, then drop 120 by 301 and begin your translation run. Grimness Control, this is Perfuga. Blessings of the Omnissiah be upon you. Sorny tapped the coordinates into her side console. The bank of servitors moved in unison. A faint rumble of inertia passed through the hull as the freighter repositioned. The Vox crackled again. Blessings and safe passage be upon you. Sorny cut the line and pushed the transmitter back into its cradle. She glanced back and, dropping into her native accent, addressed Kadon. We'll translate in a few minutes. Outside, a massive vessel glided silently past them, an Astartes strike cruiser, painted in void black and deep navy. Weapon batteries lined its hull like teeth, and the sun caught along its surfaces with cold, mechanical grace. Kadon stared at it with distaste. A strike cruiser, a predator of the void. The Perfuga looked like a toy beside it. He felt the weight of what he was up against settle into his chest. That's the Elfsip, a Wirthan ship, one of the Void Revenants, said Valkaran quietly. As they watched, the sleek black vessel was lit with green fire. A tear split open in the fabric of real space, and the cruiser passed through it, trailing smoke and ghost flames as it vanished into the warp. The void snapped shut behind it. What was that? Moyle asked, eyes wide. Baelgor, lounging with his boots up on the weapons console, spoke without looking up. Hollow emitters. Looks like our new friends in the void enjoy theatrics. Kadon gave a small nod. Impressive. Do you think we can one-up them? Baelgor sniffed and produced a dark bottle from his cloak. I don't know. Get Toland to rig some emitters on the baffles, a few glyphs on the prow. Add the right incantations. Depends what you're going for. Ethereal light, flames and sulfur, warp screams. The ship drifted slowly toward its translation point as they spoke. Fine craftsmanship. Far below the bridge, toward the prow, Dark Mechanicus Adept Toland Danks worked alone in the freezing void chamber that housed the freighter's forward weapon batteries. 2 light macro cannons, if one could call them that, stood mounted awkwardly on either side of a reinforced hull plate. They were cobbled together from mining drills, scavenged autocannon parts, and wreckage from an old deep space salvage barge, rusted, unstable, and unreliable. But it was something. A pair of guns meant the Perfuga wasn't just a freighter anymore. It was becoming a warship, and Toland was determined to make it roar, even if it blew half the power grid in the process. He heard a footfall behind him and glanced back. You the new guy? He asked, not recognizing the shadow. The shape shifted slightly, mumbling something inaudible. Toland Danax turned back to his work. He had just fitted the final cable into place. He rose to his feet and looked over the coil assembly. Yes, he thought, this would work. All along the metallic tube of the cannon, he'd installed a series of copper coils, spaced at 2-foot intervals. Each was connected to an independent power source and tied back to a larger capacitor. The theory was simple enough. When the macro cannon fired, the kinetic discharge would generate an electrostatic backlash. By mounting collector lattices along the forebarrel, he could reclaim some of that energy to recharge the auxiliary systems. Even better, the initial surge would magnetize the barrel, turning each shot into a hybrid, an old-fashioned shell boosted by a magnetic accelerator. In theory, this would double the muzzle velocity. The impact force would be immense. He allowed himself a thin smile. 1 down. 16 rods to go on this cannon, and then the next one. A loud clang echoed behind him. He turned. The coil bundle meant for the next section now lay on the grill. The 2 servitors who had carried it were gone. Frowning, he stepped forward, scanning the pipes and shadowed tunnels of the accessway. He reached the end, looking out the hatch. Nothing. Dropping down into the forward macro cannon loading bay, he called out. Only the groan of old metal replied. The huge shells stood secured in racks along the wall. Accelerant charges, primitive percussion-based types, were piled nearby. All of this had been salvaged for his work. 2 of the charge caps were missing. Another clang rang out. He turned sharply. Nothing. He ducked under a cluster of conduits, checking between the crates. Another clang. He approached one of the massive cannon breaches. The access panel was ajar. Inside, a servitor twitched. It was lodged in the bore, trying to stand, but the barrel was too narrow. The clang was its metal head slamming against the casing again and again. Both charges were armed. He reached for the lever to disengage the breach. With banners aloft and steel in her hand, the voice came from behind him. He froze. "Who are you?" he asked, turning toward the shadow. The figure stepped forward, still obscured by the dim light. "She marched on the tide to conquer the land." Tolan furrowed his brow. "Did you do this?" "Servitors aren't optimal for cleaning macro barrels. You need servo skulls or auto tenders, this is." He stopped mid-sentence. "And the lady did go. She did. And the lady—" The voice drifted closer. Tolan pulled his Serpenta pistol, hand steady. "Now hold there," he warned. The figure kept walking, dragging something behind. But the sea took her name, and the sea took her kin. Markham stepped into the light. The edges of his uniform were frayed and damp. Boils marred the exposed flesh of his neck and wrists. Sweat streamed down his face. His eyes flickered. His lips twitched with unnatural joy. "You need Medicae," Tolan said. Then he remembered. Grimness. The outbreak. His eyes widened. "Stand back," he commanded, voice rising. Markham smiled. The waves rose up and pulled them all in. He dropped to the deck as if convulsing. Tolan instinctively stepped forward. And that's when he saw it. A long, sickly appendage extended from the base of Markham's spine, barbed, quivering, tense. It shot forward. Tolan fired, but the Serpenta wavered. Too late. The spike pierced his chest. The pistol fell to the deck with a dull clang. The eye between stars. The corridor to the navigator's sphere was empty, lined with thick cables and softly glowing conduits that pulsed with residual warp charge. Ingusor walked in silence, the hem of his fine cloak brushing the reinforced decking. A faint scent of spices and oil trailed him, expensive oils meant to soothe the strain of those touched by the warp. He moved with poise, unaffected by the tension in the rest of the ship. This was his sanctuary. The Perfuga groaned beneath his feet as systems reoriented. They were almost in position, almost ready. He passed beneath the sigils of warding, stepped through the final bulkhead, and entered the navigator's sphere. A soft hum greeted him. Cold, quiet, sacred. The chamber was half lit, a globe of shadowed glass and gold circuitry suspended in isolation. A single throne-like chair sat in the center. Around him, filtration fans whispered, releasing tracer incense into the atmosphere. Warp-suppressant glyphs flickered at the edges of the sphere. Ingusor ascended the narrow staircase and placed one pale hand on the back of the throne. He paused, closed his eyes. There it is, the path, the pattern, the angles. He focused. Navigational coordinates unfolded in his mind's eye like blooming metal flowers, abstract, impossible to mortals, but clean and clear to him. The route burned behind his eyelids, etched in fire. He smiled and sat. With a flick of his mind, he lowered the final barriers. The thin membrane between real space and the immaterium peeled back. His third eye, long concealed behind a silvered veil, opened within the depths of his skull, and the warp touched him back. And oh, how it welcomed him. The immaterium was a howling storm, but to Ingusor it was a familiar ocean. He could feel it even now, pressing at the edges of his perception like the tide at a shoreline. Waves of madness, emotion, raw thought, coiling around the vessel like a lover's embrace. It knew him. He reached out, casting long tendrils of awareness ahead through the path, aligning the ship's trajectory to the only line that would hold. Translation in 3, 2. The Perfuga lurched, space folded, time stilled, and Ingusor entered the storm. He was home. Riding through the long waves of the warp, he guided the ship across impossible angles, through currents visible only to those of the navigator houses. Ghosts whispered around him, echoes of dreams long dead. He smiled again, more fully now. And then, an explosion. The ship bucked. Pain lanced through his skull as equilibrium snapped. He screamed. No sound, only thought, shattering in the sphere like glass under pressure. The warp, welcoming, soothing, twisted. Something surged, a pulse of wrongness, a scar across the path. And the Perfuga was falling. Up above, the bridge was quiet. Moments before a warp translation were always tense, but they were still within Imperial space, surrounded by Imperial vessels. Even though the Perfuga flew Imperial colors and had paid off the right authorities, Kadon knew better than to trust appearances. Kadon Ferrisborn sat in brooding silence. Even as a veteran of the Old Seventh, he had never been this deep into Imperial space without bolter fire. This new kind of warfare, skulking gene heist subterfuge, was alien to him. He wondered, not for the first time, if the heresy would have ended differently had they fought like this from the start. Belgor reclined lazily, bottle in hand. Moyle, headset on, listened to Vox traffic. Sorny, seated at the helm, wore her usual sneer. She hated warp travel, called it never space in the old tribal tongue. To her people, it was hell. Valcheron stared out the picked viewer, murmuring names of ships idling nearby. The Tracier Adept, strange to see her this far from Sarathar. Imperial banner, Trantor ship, probably lifting pressed iron for their domes. Omnissiah Luxor, bound for the Rust Belt, no doubt. Kadon glanced over at the word-bearer in Emberhand's colors. The man was a font of knowledge. More scribe than preacher, truth be told. He refocused on the viewport as the moment came. Sorny's hand gripped the throttle, her touch gentle but firm. The Perfuga's brute force engines fired, lurching them forward. A ragged tear opened before them, a wound in reality itself, and far below, Navigator Ingusor guided them across the veil. The Perfuga nosed into the warp. The hatch behind slammed open. "Stop the translation," Astalon shouted. Forward decks, macro battery section. Tolan Danax rose slowly, slime dripping from his lips. His ears rang. The macro cannon bay stank of blood and burning oil. He could hear metal, banging. From inside the barrel, looking across, he saw the power coils glowing. He smiled. His blood-slicked hand found the lever. Behind him, a voice, singing. The waves rose up and pulled them all in. He depressed the lever. He was vaporized instantly. The discharge liquefied the servitors in the barrel, reducing them to glowing ore. The shell they had loaded became a storm of iron plasma, detonating mid-barrel. Bridge. Seconds later, they heard the blast just as the ship crossed the threshold. Alarm screamed. The blast shields were halfway down. The forward hull vanished. A shockwave surged up the spine of the Perfuga and slammed into the bridge. Sidon was hurled into the bulkhead. Astalon and Moyle crashed into the floor. Belgor extended a single hand, catching them both in a flickering gravitic snare. Valcheron, less lucky, was thrown into the picked screen bank. Consoles shattered like bone under his impact. Lights strobed. Gas vented. Kadon struggled upright. Everything hurt. Sealant foam guttered from the seams of his armor. He looked at Valcheron, covered in blood-tinted foam, unmoving. "Damage report," he shouted, or thought he did. The sound echoed like screaming into a steel drum. Sorny unclipped her harness. She'd been the only one strapped in, and turned. Her lips moved, but Kadon couldn't hear. She rolled her eyes and signed instead. Word-bearer battle sign, close enough to Iron Hand's code for him to catch the gist. Jeller field intact on surviving hull sections. Deck 7 exposed. First 2 compartments voided. Fire in compartment 3. 3 portholds collapsed to bolter shell size. Navigator sphere, now a garden. Brute force engines no longer exist. And most confusingly, a large sand troll says the pond frogs are alive and well. That last bit made Kadon blink. Then he remembered. Word-bearers didn't have sand. Troll probably meant Mechanicus. Frogs, gene seed pods. The gene seed is intact. He gave her a sign of thanks. She looked offended. He shrugged and asked for current position. She turned back to the Jeller field controls. Valcheron was carried out on a makeshift stretcher. That left only Belgor and Astalon. "What happened?" Kadon shouted. Astalon winced, clutching his ears. Belgor silenced him and looked at Kadon, then into him. A voice echoed in his skull. "The Trinova malady is aboard. A cultist named Markham is the carrier." Sadon stared. They were trapped in the immaterium, carrying stolen gene seed that must not be exposed to the warp, and there was a daemon plague running through the crew. He walked silently to the armory off the bridge. Inside, he found sand, a pile of it, sitting where he swore an arms rack had once been. A helmet he'd lost 4 centuries ago lay on the floor. He picked up his bolter, it felt oddly soft, and checked his relics. Neverborn, the daemon blade, and Songmaker, the chorused heavy bolter, both intact. But no longer possessed. He took a deep breath. From here, things got more complicated.